Welcome, members and visitors, to the October monthly membership meeting of the League of Women Voters of Monterey County. I'm Marianne Gawain, the president, and my co-presenter today will be our treasurer, Marilyn Maxner. We will be sharing with you background information and some of the pros and cons arguments for the 7 ballot measures that are before all Californians on the November 8th, 2022 general election ballot. Marilyn and I hope to give you foundational information on which you can base your own voting decisions. At the end, we'll put up a reference slide with some additional information if you want to do further reading. A great starting point for concision and clarity is your easy voter guide, and we sent that out to everyone along with the voter. I actually think I get my mails more slowly than anyone in the county, and I got mine, so I hope you got yours. And the other great starting point resource is votersedge.org. That's much more in depth. It's a service of the California League, but supported by local leagues. And I'd like to thank Arlene Guest and Olivia Mandalik, if I'm not mispronouncing her last name, for their efforts. They have been working very hard to get local candidate statements onto Voters Edge. If you want the slides that we're using, Dennis can get those to you, but you would need to email the League general email address, which is lwvmryco@gmail.com. And if you belong to a group that would benefit from hearing a live presentation of today's talks, you should also send that request to the email address. We will try to accommodate you, but it depends on the availability of speakers. We have spoken at Aromas Grange already, and we'll be speaking at Merrill Gardens and Park Lane in Monterey in the coming week. As noted in the publicity for today, we are addressing only the 7 statewide ballot measures. Many voters will face local questions regarding, for example, school bonds, sales taxes. I think there are a couple of cannabis-related questions locally. And again, that information is on Voters Edge, which is really quite comprehensive. So start that with that for your launch pad. We have a county-wide ballot measure, and that's Measure Q. Measure Q is a proposed parcel tax over 10 years that would support childcare. And again, you can read pros and cons about that Measure Q, which should be on everybody's ballot. It's countywide. Okay, a word about the format. So we want to respect everyone's time and focus energy, and we're going to try to get through this in just over an hour with 7 measures. That means that we just have time for a few questions on each of them, and we want to take the questions after each segment. Can we now turn to Marilyn to get us started?
So we're going to talk about the 7 propositions that are on the November election next. For those of you who may be watching who are not members of the League, we just want to make sure that you understand that we do not support or oppose candidates or parties, but we encourage active participation, and we do that by studying, and we influence public policy that way. And you will see in one of these propositions, the League of Women Voters of California supports it. But that is it, and we'll talk more about that when we get there. Next. What is a proposition? It's a proposed law presented to the public for a vote, and through that you can make new laws, affirm or defeat existing laws. That's a referendum, and one of the propositions today is a referendum. You can change existing laws, or you can change the California Constitution. Next. A proposition is placed on the ballot either by state lawmakers or by the initiative. You've all seen people with wanting you to sign petitions at Safeway or other stores, and you can see it depends on the number of signatures that you need to get an initiative on the ballot. Next. Just for your information, we don't have any bonds this time, but the California budget is almost $308 billion. Most of that, $234 billion, is in the general fund. There are special funds of $69 billion, and there are bond funds of almost $4.5 billion. Next. Proposition 1. It's a constitutional right to reproductive freedom and it was proposed by the legislature, it would amend the Constitution. Next. It would add language to the California Constitution to specifically affirm a person's right to birth control, reproductive care, abortion before the fetus is medically viable, and afterwards, if it's necessary to save someone's life. Next. In 1973, Roe versus Wade recognized the right to contraceptives and reproductive health. In 2022, just this few months ago, Dobbs versus Jackson, the Supreme Court overturned Roe and eliminated federal protection for the right to an abortion. Next. In 1969, the California Supreme Court ruled that California's right to privacy clause implies the right to reproductive care, including an abortion. But California can only restrict abortions for state interests such as safety and health. Next. There are approximately 13 million Californians now on Medi-Cal. The federal and state Medicaid Medi-Cal health coverage includes contraceptive services and abortion for California residents. California and the federal government share the cost of most Medi-Cal services, including contraceptives, but California pays the full cost of Medi-Cal abortions. Next. There are about 2 million Californians undercovered in California. Those benefits include reproductive rights, contraception, and abortion. California and the US government share the cost to subsidize those premiums, including premiums for reproductive and contraceptive coverage, but California alone pays for the premium to cover abortion. Next. Proposition 1 would amend the California Constitution to explicitly guarantee right to personal reproductive decisions, including use of birth control, reproductive health services, and abortion before the fetus is viable, and abortion to save the health or the life of the mother. Next. Proposition 1 would have no fiscal effects in California because the existing rights to reproductive freedom already exist. Next. So if you vote yes, you're supporting amending the Constitution to prohibit the state from interfering with or denying an individual's reproductive freedom, defined to include a right to contraceptives and abortion. If you vote no, you oppose this amendment, and it will not be part of the Constitution. Next. What do the supporters say? Prop 1 will enshrine the fundamental right to contraception and abortion. Doctors, nurses, health providers all agree that yes on 1 is necessary to keep reproductive medical decisions where they belong, with individuals and their healthcare providers, not political arguments. Next. Opponents say women already have the right to choose under current California law. The Dobbs ruling did or will not change this. It's not needed to protect women's health or reproductive rights. Abortion seekers from outside California will swamp California resources, and that this should not be part of the California Constitution. Next. Who supports Prop 1? A lot of medical associations, as you would understand, the California Federation of Teachers, and this is the proposition that the League of Women Voters of California support. We have signed the ballot measure for that. Next. Who opposes it? Religious groups, Democrats for Life in America, and the Republican Party of California. Next. There's been a little over $9 million raised to support Proposition 1. Over half of it comes from the federal Indians Grattan Rancheria, I can't even pronounce that. Then others from places where you would expect. Next. We have only raised, the donors against this have only raised almost $72,000. And you can see most of them are from one organization. Next. We always look for newspaper article or editorials about the propositions because they give a lot of good arguments. They say why they are against something or for something, and it helps you think about how you want to approach the proposition. For Prop 1, we couldn't find any newspapers against it, and we saw these 4 major ones in favor of it. Next. I don't see anything about this proposition.
Now let's take a look at propositions 26 and 27. These are somewhat related because they both pertain to what sort of gambling should be permitted in the state and who should be permitted to be the sponsors of this gambling activity. 26 would allow in-person roulette, dice games, and sports wagering on tribal lands. So this is an expansion of tribal gaming activity. And 27 allows online and mobile sports wagering outside tribal lands. So this is focused on online betting and sports betting. And these involve constitutional amendment, I think probably because they relate to the relationship between the state and the autonomous Indian tribes. Next. So currently, the sort of gambling that is permitted or prohibited is defined within the Constitution. It's pretty narrow. The California lottery is allowed, as is bingo, legal card rooms, and they can offer specific type of gambling. There's parimutuel betting allowed at 7 online sites, and there are certain games that can be offered at Indian casinos, and you can see a list of those there. Next. So we have a prohibition in California on Nevada's casino-style gambling, on sports betting, and really any gambling that's not specifically approved. Next. In 2018, the US Supreme Court struck down federal law banning sports betting in all states but Nevada. And since then, about 35 states have legalized some form of sports betting. Our neighbor Oregon, for example, permits sports betting on site and on 1 online vendor. And nearby Arizona permits 3 online vendors to offer gambling. Next, because American Indian tribes are sovereign nations, the regulation of their activities, including the gambling that they can offer, is limited by compacts. These are negotiated between the tribes, the state, and the federal government. And the framework for this is the Federal Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. In 2021, California Indian casinos earned about $8.5 billion in gambling revenue, and California derived a share of $65 million. We used that revenue in the state to fund casino regulation and gambling addiction programs. Next. So Proposition 26 would expand, as you can see, the kind of gambling that would be permitted to roulette, dice games, and sports betting on the premises in Indian casinos. And it would also allow sports betting on 4 racetracks that you see listed here. Next, it includes some requirements. So there would have to be a negotiation between the tribes and the state, but racetracks would have to pay 10% of their net bets to California, most of that going to the general fund and the rest going to some gambling enforcement and gambling addiction mental health treatment. The state would have to set up an oversight system, and that would include laws, enforcement protocols, consumer protections, and so on. And there would be civil penalties for violations. Furthermore, if the Attorney General did not enforce these regulations, individuals would be permitted to sue. Next, Proposition 27, as we said, has a little bit different focus. It allows adults 21 and over on specified online sites to make bets on sports events. That's all levels, including professional, collegiate, and amateur, and other competitive events, including award shows, non-athletic competitions, and current events. Next, but no betting would be allowed on youth sports, on elections, domestic or foreign, and by those involved in sports, coaches, staff, or players. Next, Proposition 27 would permit 2 types of corporations or organizations to run this online sports betting. The first would be American Indian tribes that offer online sports bets, and they would do this under their own name. Or large gambling companies, and they would have to be already offering online betting in 10 or more states. They would offer betting under their own name, but they would have to enter into a compact with a tribe. Next, Proposition 27 sets operators' licensing fees. These are significant. And it specifies how the 10% net bets going to the state would be allocated. First, they would pay for regulatory and enforcement costs. Then they would pay for homeless services, projects to address homelessness. And finally, a small portion would be revenue sharing with non-gaming tribes. Next. So both of these propositions involve, as I said, an amendment to the Constitution, a framework for gambling that would then not be able to be further amended except by a public vote. They would establish new regulatory systems in the state and set new laws governing sports betting criteria, such as who can bet, who can't bet, and what are the fees, penalties, and the profit sharing plan. Next. You may have heard discussion in the media and ads and so forth on what would be the impact on school revenue. So we have addressed that here specifically. Proposition 98 in 1988 set a minimum standard that 40% of the general funds in California must be guaranteed for K through 12 schools. Proposition 26 revenues, the payment would go to the general fund. So a certain amount of that, the 40% of that, would be an increase in school revenues. And for Proposition 27, the profit sharing money after enforcement goes to gambling regulation and homelessness. So none of that revenue is directed at schools. Next. You may have similarly heard discussion of the impact of these measures on expenditures for homeless services. As we said, Proposition 26 requires the tribe's payment to go into the general fund. So there's an increase in the potential money available for homeless services, but it's not pre-allocated. In Proposition 27, the 10% net betting revenue goes to the special online betting fund. And after enforcement and regulatory costs are paid, 85% of that balance goes to homeless support services, with 15% of it going to the shared tribal economic development. Next. What would be the fiscal impact? Wow, there is a great deal of uncertainty here. We don't know what the new regulatory infrastructure and staffing would be like. We don't know the details of the new requirements. We can't be assured now what kind of negotiations would, what the outcome would be as we negotiate with the tribes. We are uncertain about what 10% of net online bets would come to. And we really don't know how many people would be taking advantage of the new gambling opportunities, perhaps not gambling then in card rooms, but gambling online or in Indian casinos. We don't know how many people might become addicted. And so we don't have a feeling for enforcement costs. There's a great deal of uncertainty. Next. If you vote yes on 26, it would be a vote in favor of more gambling, expanded types of gambling, and sports betting within Indian casinos. A vote in favor of Proposition 27 means legalized sports betting would be permitted outside of casinos. No on either one of these then means that we would not be expanding these sorts of gambling opportunities in the state. Now, I just want to take a minute and clarify, these are not mutually exclusive measures. So of course, both could fail, one could pass, but both could pass. If both were to pass, and if someone were to contend that some aspect of one or the other is in conflicts, the court would have to decide, and then the measure that had received more votes, its provision of the two conflicting provisions would override the other. But even if the two measures were to conflict in one area, if they didn't conflict in other areas, all the non-conflicting provisions could come into play. Next. What are the arguments in favor of Proposition 26? proponents say that it could help with Indian self-sufficiency. It would benefit our state by generating revenue for state programs and schools, and it would generate more jobs at tribal casinos, and it's a very responsible way to authorize sports betting. Next, its opponents say that the measure has been sponsored by powerful interests, and would use this enforcement to damage the business of card rooms through litigation, because there have been quite a few longstanding disputes between the tribal casinos and the card rooms. And other opponents contend that expanding gambling at racetracks would save an injury that is in fact killing and injuring many horses. Next, Proposition 26 opponents say that it will not benefit non-tribal residents or communities, that some California cities depend on legal card rooms to fund city services, and that it doesn't advance sports wagering, but it is merely an expansion of tribal casinos' monopoly. Okay, now we'll consider the proponents and opponents of Measure 27. The proponents contend that state-of-the-art technology can ensure that minors are not going to be placing bets, and that there will be strict new auditing of online sports betting trust fund, and we will be sure that the money is used for those who are homeless and for tribes that do not offer sports betting. The opponents of Proposition 27 say online sports betting will not generate jobs or create investment in California because it will be run by out-of-state operators, and they are retaining 90% of the profits. The opponents also say that allowing promotional bets to be deducted from gross betting reduces the revenue to the state. Who supports Proposition 26? You can see that it is a number of bands of Indian tribes that are now offering gaming. And its opponents are the owners of the card rooms. Also, animal rights organization, some cities, mostly in the LA basin, because that's where most of the card rooms are, some unions, and the Republican Party of California. Now let's look at the Proposition 27 supporters. They include Major League Baseball, several Indian tribes with casinos, as listed here, and some regional homeless coalitions and mayors. Also, we have some of those listed. Opponents of Proposition 27 are a number of Indian tribes and gambling associations, the League of California Cities, housing coalitions, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Teachers Association, and at least one union listed here. Next. Donors have raised more than $123 million in favor of 26. And this money came from Indian tribes with gaming interests currently. The top donors for no on Prop 26 are the card room companies, and they have raised more than $43 million. The donors in favor of 27 include large national gaming companies that would be eligible to offer gaming in the state under Prop 27. Next. And the donors opposed are the same Indian tribes who have interests in the current gambling infrastructure setup that we have in California. Next. We did not find editorial statements in favor of Proposition 26, and we found a number against. You might want to look at these arguments, including the LA Times, more locally, the San Jose Mercury News and Santa Cruz Sentinel. Next. We did not find editorials in favor of Proposition 27. Again, some of the same newspapers who were against Proposition 26 also opposed Proposition 27. A yes vote on Proposition 26 or on Proposition 27 would mean increased opportunities. For 26, that would be increased opportunities to gamble in Indian casinos, and 27, online sports betting. A no vote would mean no change to the current rules on gambling in California. As I said before, they're not mutually exclusive. Both could pass, both could fail, either one could pass. Just some prospective thoughts. This is a very, very expensive measure because it's about how much legal gambling we are going to have in our communities and about who will control it. It's the most expensive ballot fight in US history at more than $400 million spent. The competing interests, as you will have gathered, are the wealthy Native American tribes that sponsor gambling, legal card room industry, the large online gambling companies nationally, lesser affluent tribes who are not currently generating gambling revenues, and then state and local agencies that would have to deal with a new enforcement regimen, gambling addiction, possible crime. Yes, it does not require Tam is asking if it's a simple majority, and that is so. The higher bar for the constitutional amendments is that I think you have to have 8% rather than 5% of voters on signing the petitions to put it on the ballot.
That's signing the petitions that put the proposition on the ballot.
Right.
It doesn't make it this now.
Sharon asks, does California have to pay for people from out of state who come here for abortions? No. We already are paying through Covered California and Medi-Cal for abortions for California state residents, and we would continue to do so, and we would not, there's no provision here that we would be paying for abortions from people from out of state. How would online states know whether it's 21? And GB is asking, how would 21 and older be regulated? I do not have the knowledge of how valid this contention is that there's state-of-the-art verification. So that would be something for us to investigate. What does Major League Sports, baseball get out of expanded sports betting? That I don't know either. Again, another question of state-of-the-art verification. And right, maybe Libby is speculating some possibilities of why, and I don't know. All right, so that's my answer, is pretty much I don't know. Okay, Marilyn, are you ready to launch us on another one?
Now we're going to talk about Prop 28, which is funding arts and music education. This is not a constitutional amendment. This would just be a law. Next. Beginning in 1988, as Marianne said earlier, 40% of the general fund is earmarked for K-12 education. The amount spent on arts and music is determined by each local school district. Next. Proposition 28 would provide another 1% of the general fund would be contributed for arts and music education. And schools serving low-income students would receive a bit more. What is the fiscal impact? There'd be about $1 billion more to be dedicated to arts and music education, but taxes would not be raised. So a yes vote means you want more funds from the general fund to be designated for arts and music education. A no vote means funding mechanisms would remain the same, and it would be up to the schools whether they have them or not. Next, the supporters of Prop 28 say arts and music education can improve a student's personal and academic life. And only 1 in 5 schools has a dedicated teacher for arts programs, and too often that kind of education is the first to be cut when funding is tight. Next, the opponents say arts education is not the only need, and earmarking 1% for arts education is 1% not available for other pressing needs, housing, climate, fire, etc. Let the legislature set the budget. Let the local schools allocate the funds based on the curriculum best suited for their students. Next, the supporters, Austin Butner, the former Los Angeles Unified School District Superintendent, who is also an investment advisor and newspaper publisher. He's done many things. Former Secretary of Education, the California Teachers Association, and many organizations that support the arts. The opponents, we haven't been able to find any. The donors on Proposition 28 have donated almost $9.5 million. And as you can see, most of that is from that aforesaid Austin Buettner. And again, we found no donors against Proposition 28. Next. Editorials. Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Daily News are for it. San Jose Mercury News is against it. Next. So if you vote yes, additional funds from the general fund will be designated for arts and music education. If you vote no, funding mechanisms would remain the same. Next. Any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions on this particular subject. So we'll go on to the next proposition. And that's Proposition 29. Again, it would be a law, not an amendment to the Constitution, and it's the requirements for dialysis clinics. Next. Proposition 29 asks, should outpatient dialysis clinics be required to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant on site at all hours when patients are being treated? And should it provide various clinic-related information to patients and the state? There are about 650 licensed dialysis clinics in California, and there are about 80,000 Californians who get dialysis each year, and that's 4 hours a day, 3 times a week. Most dialysis is paid for by Medicare or Medi-Cal at fixed rates at around the average cost per treatment. Next. And again, now each patient must be visited by his or her physician at the clinic at least once a month. And each clinic must employ a medical director who is a board certified physician 1/4 of the time. Private insurance companies cover dialysis for the first 30 months at negotiated rates. And sometimes that's a lot more than Medicare or Medi-Cal pay. And Davida Inc. from Colorado and Fresenius Medical in Germany own or operate 75% of the clinics in California, and they're both for-profit organizations. And the estimated clinic revenue every year is $3.5 billion. Proposition 29 would require chronic dialysis clinics to have a physician, nurse practitioner, or assistant on site at all hours when patients are being treated. And it would provide various clinic-related information to patients in the states as follows. It would tell patients the name of any physician with more than a 5% interest in the clinic, and it would report information about dialysis-related infection among its patients. It would not discriminate based on the patient's source of payment, and it would obtain permission from the state to close or reduce hours. The fiscal impact would increase state and local government oversights, which would be likely in the low tens of millions of dollars annually. So if you vote yes for 29, you would want each dialysis clinic to have an on-site doctor, nurse, or PA. It would add reporting requirements. You want the state to consent to close clinics, and there's no patient discrimination due to the source of the payment, whether it's medical, Medicare, or private. No vote means we don't want to change anything. Proposition 29 supporters say these companies can afford to make staffing changes and still profit by $100 million a year. The long process of dialysis physically draining and leaves patients vulnerable. Having a physician or nurse practitioner could help. Adding reporting requirements would increase transparency. They also say this SEIU, Healthcare Workers West, wants to reform the booming dialysis industry and increase transparency. It requires a medical person to be present during dialysis, a dangerous procedure. It's common sense and safety. And clinics face fewer inspections than other health facilities. Deficiencies are often uncovered during these inspections. The opponents say clinics already use specially trained technicians. All patients are under the care of their own kidney doctor. It would require thousands of skilled medical staff be moved from hospitals where they are very much needed to clinical administration. It would adding non-treating on-site administrators cost $100 million or more a year, forcing clinics to reduce hours or close. And clinics already report infection data to the federal government. They also say this is a union ploy to pressure clinics and organized dialysis workers. 8 states and the District of Columbia have mandated staffing requirements, but patient satisfaction and safety are not superior there. California's outcomes are amongst the best in the United States, and this would increase state and local government costs. Who supports this proposition? The United Health West and the SEIU, the California Democratic Party, and the Peace and Freedom Party. Who is against it? Well, the two clinics that run 75% of the clinics, or the two organizations, California, all various medical associations, the California Republican Party. The donors, the supporters have raised about $8 million, all from this one union. Next. And the opponents have raised $86 million, almost all of it from the two companies that run the dialysis clinics in California. We could find no editorials in favor of Proposition 29, and you can see many were against it. Next. So just to put it in a little bit of perspective, similar initiatives were on the ballot in 2018 and in 2020, and they were both defeated. So again, yes means you require an on-site doctor, nurse, or PA. It adds reporting requirements. It requires a state to consent to close clinics, and no patient discrimination due to source of payment. And a no vote means no changes.
You have one from Michelle Welsh asking, is there a problem with dialysis clinics that this is intended to address?
Not that we know, Mickey. That's just, it just depends on which side of this proposition you want to believe, because some say yes and some say no.
But I don't
We
think
found nothing specific. No.
Our research didn't bring to light statistics
No.
about that. And Sharon asks, how can the state force a company to keep clinics open? Couldn't they just close up shop and move out of state?
That's a good question, and I never saw anything in any of the research that answered that question or even spoke to it.
I'm up for Proposition 30.
Mm-hmm.
Proposition 30 would raise taxes on incomes of $2 million and above, and it would be used to boost zero emission vehicles. It's an initiative statute. Gas-powered cars and wildfire smoke are the two largest sources of greenhouse emissions in our state. And the state does already have a commitment. We've seen a range of figures on this, but a plausible number is $10 billion over 5 years to support zero emission vehicles. The state currently spends $2 to $4 billion annually on wildfire response. Currently, the legislature apportions income tax revenues to meet the needs of the state as it deems appropriate through a budget process. The marginal tax rate for California income over $2 million is now 13.3%. So under Proposition 30, for every dollar of personal income over 2 million, an additional assessment of 1.75% would be levied, and that would raise the marginal tax rate, as you can see, to 15.05%. As a matter of comparison, the next highest state marginal tax rates are Hawaii's at 11%, New Jersey's at 10.75%, and Oregon's at 9.9%. 80% of the money generated by this tax is designated for increased use of zero emission vehicles through purchase subsidies and infrastructure construction. And just as an aside, if you're wondering what qualifies as a ZEV, obviously mostly that's electric cars, but at some point there might be hydrogen powered cars that would qualify. And the other 20% would be used to help manage wildfires. Proposition 30 would likely raise between $3.5 and $5 billion each year by raising the state income tax on high earners. It's hard to be precise because sometimes people can shift their income in certain ways, or they can shift themselves in certain ways. Next. So a yes vote would mean that the state income tax rate would be raised for the highest earners, and that additional funds generated would be used towards increasing use of ZEVs and managing wildfires. And a no would mean that the tax rate remains the same. Proposition 30 supporters say that the existing programs are insufficient to address greenhouse gas emissions, that Proposition 30 would make ZEVs more affordable, and that we need more money to manage wildfires in California. The opponents of Proposition 30 argue that if these projects are so very important, the legislature should increase their funding from the general fund. Designating funds for specific purposes reduces budget flexibility to meet future unknown needs. Opponents of Proposition 30 also say that the subsidies would disproportionately benefit corporations transitioning to zero-emission vehicles. And Governor Newsom has said specifically that the company Lyft is trying to offload its costs of moving to electrical vehicles onto affluent taxpayers. Next. The supporters of Proposition 30 are Lyft, the California Democratic Party, the Union of Electrical Workers, and the American Lung Association. And its opponents include the Governor, Chamber of Commerce, Teachers Association, Republican Party, and Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. Donors for yes on Prop 30 have raised more than $37 million, with almost all of that coming from the car ride-sharing company Lyft. No on Proposition 30 is supported by wealthy individuals, and you can see their names there. We found that the San Francisco Chronicle is a supporter of Proposition 30, and other large state newspapers listed here have editorialized against it. A yes vote would mean that the state income tax rate would be increased for high earners and the additional funds would be designated for Prop 30's goals. And a no vote means that the tax rate remains the same and we don't have those revenues to allocate. To put this in perspective, when this initiative was put forward, we did not have the recent ZEV mandate. So the Legislative Analyst's Office said at that time when they were analyzing it before the ZEV mandate had passed, they said the effect would be unknown and that the state was considering requirements and so on and so forth. But it also then stated that if the state approves the ZEV mandate, Proposition 30 would not have much effect on the number of zero-emission vehicles driven in California. And so that has now happened. So that is the piece of the analysts' analysis that I think we can look to. It also says that Proposition 30 would have an effect on who pays for the vehicles. So effectively, what's happening is the high-income taxpayers are subsidizing the ZEV purchasers. Are we ready for some questions? Amy Anderson is asking, this means the state would be spending this money for state use for ZEVs, not that it would help lower the cost of ZEVs for private buyers, correct? No, that is not my understanding. So the state would be generating a fund that could be tapped, not merely for, say, a municipality wanting to electrify its school bus fleet or something. I think the contention is that this money would be accessible to private buyers in some way, and that is why Lyft is favoring it. And the governor says that it's shifting Lyft's costs to high-income taxpayers. So I don't understand exactly the allocation mechanism between state, local government, and private buyers and corporate private buyers, individual buyers, but my understanding is that definitely some of this money would be available for private purchases of ZEVs. And Debbie is asking if there is a requirement that the money be used only by or for individuals. No. I didn't see any contention about that. And again, because I think Lyft is a focus of some of the debate, that is not the case, because I think Lyft would probably have made the point that this is only directed at private buyers. So that's as adequately as I can answer that question. All righty, let's move on then. Next, Dennis, we'll move on to 31. Proposition 31 is a referendum. So here we have our referendum that's on the ballot. This is a referendum on a 2020 law that would prohibit the retail sale of certain flavored tobacco in California. Next. About 10% of Californians use tobacco products. And that includes both cigarettes and ENDS, as we call electronic nicotine delivery system. So as you can see here, that's things like vaping, e-cigarettes, cartridges. Among tobacco product users, about 20% of adults and half of young people use menthol flavored cigarettes. And most of the ENDS users use flavored products. Next. In 2020, the California legislature passed SB 793. So this would ban the sale of flavored tobacco products and tobacco flavor enhancers. There's just like a very few exceptions here for hookahs and premium cigars, but basically flavored tobacco products are taken off the table. But then there was a petition drive to place a referendum on the law on the ballot. And so now the law will only go into effect if this referendum is approved by the voters. Next. So Proposition 31 is an affirmation of SB 793, and it would thereby ban in-store and vending machine sales of most flavored tobacco products. Next. What's the fiscal impact? Right now, California tobacco taxes amount to about $2 billion. And this money is used for healthcare programs, including Medi-Cal. Some is directed at early childhood programs and some at tobacco cessation and control. Next. It's very uncertain what the fiscal impact would be. It would likely reduce tobacco tax revenue. And you see there's a wide range here, 10 million to 100 million, because it would result in some reduction in tobacco use. We don't know how much, because we don't know how many people would shift then from flavored to non-flavored tobacco products and how many would perhaps give up tobacco use entirely. And there would be resultant better health if people do not consume as much tobacco. But again, that is hard to calculate what the reduction in healthcare costs would be. Next. So to reiterate, a vote yes is an affirmation of SB 793, upholding the ban on sales of flavored tobacco products and allowing that ban to be enforced. And a no vote means that SB 793 would be repealed and the sale of flavored tobacco would continue to be legal in California. What do the supporters say? They say that Big Tobacco has spent millions lobbying to keep California retailers selling these candy flavored products. And these are the products that find their way into the hands of children. Right now, more than 2 million high school and middle school students use e-cigarettes, and 4 out of 5 kids who use tobacco started with a flavored product. Many of these e-cig users say that they use them because they like the flavors. And the supporters point out that SB 793 doesn't criminalize individuals for purchasing or possessing flavored tobacco products. So there does not need to be a worry that it would lead to police harassment for people having these products, such as menthol cigarettes. Next. The opponents of Proposition 31 say that it's an adult prohibition. It's already illegal in California to sell tobacco products to anyone under 21. And Proposition 31 would simply shift these products, enabling criminal gangs to benefit, and there would be smuggling and underground markets, and this can lead to increases in neighborhood crime. And quite simply, prohibition never works. The supporters are at the top, Michael Bloomberg, who is an outspoken anti-tobacco advocate, as well as a businessman and former mayor of New York, Gavin Newsom, Kaiser Foundation, California Teachers Association, a number of health associations that you can see here as well. The opponents are quite simply the tobacco companies and tobacco stores. Donors to yes on Prop 31 have raised more than $6 million, with the bulk of that coming from Michael Bloomberg at $4.3 million. Kaiser Foundation has put in over $1 million, and then health associations are much smaller donors. The no on Proposition 31 has raised $23 million, mostly from RJ Reynolds and Philip Morris, and the rest from smaller amounts from somewhat smaller tobacco brands. Editorial statements, we found a number in favor of 31, and the one against 31, if you wanted to see an anti perspective, is the LA Daily News. Okay. Yes, Libby McMahon's asking, please confirm it bans menthol. Yes, it is a ban on menthol, as well as other flavors, not just the mango madness or whatever. Okay, and Tama is clarifying that, yes, of the 80-20 split, that 35 goes to charging infrastructure, including in lower income communities, or where there are multiple dwelling units and things like that as well. So maybe apartment houses. And 45% is incentives of the purchase of SEZs, not restricted to private individuals. Thank you, Tama. That's really good information to have up. Okay. Well, if we're all burned out, we can wrap it up. And it would be wonderful to see everybody next month at the November meeting, which will focus on cannabis. So that will be, I think we have a really interesting speaker for that. Any other announcements, or can we all wave goodbye? I guess we're all muted. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Share the link with anyone else who'd like to hear about these.